If in combat time is the most precious resource that we have, why do we take so long to decide and to produce orders? We look at the state of land command in the 21st century.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 97 of the Principles of War podcast, Something Rotten. We're going to take a 2-episode detour to look at the command and control function within a headquarters. Once we finish the assessment of the 53rd Battalion's performance at Isurava, I think it'll be really important to reflect on some of the requirements for good command and control of a battalion in contact and the deficiencies that may have existed within Maroubra Force. Today we're going to be looking at the purpose, products, process and people within modern headquarters and some of the problems that they face. To do that, I'm very honoured to have retired Lieutenant Colonel Jim Storr on the podcast today. Colonel Storr was an infantry officer serving in the British Army for 25 years. During that time, he had a range of postings to brigade level and higher headquarters, including multinational and joint headquarters. He also had a role in the introduction of digital battlefield management systems, and he wrote high-level doctrine. He's held a range of academic positions, including a Professor of War Studies at the Norwegian Military Academy. His doctorate covered the nature of military thought. He is the author of 5 books, the latest of which is Something Rotten, Land Command in the 21st Century. I think that this is a really important book. It offers a plethora of examples that illustrates the decay of the command function from what I would argue was the apogee of command capability, which was at the end of the Second World War. That acme of excellence was based on 6 years of experience in high-intensity warfare, backed by a Darwinian selection process for people and processes that produced victory. Commanders, unable to make good decisions in a timely fashion and promulgate them to their subordinates, were often killed, captured or sacked. Today, we run the risk of having headquarters that are able to follow a doctrinal process and produce doctrinal products, not understanding what would have looked like back in World War II, where the time advantage generated by the development of orders very quickly produced a significant combat advantage, especially when conducting a maneuver battle. Just one quick example that demonstrates the importance of seizing, retaining and exploiting the initiative and flexibility in combat, I think, is the 9th Australian Division's 20th Brigade. They landed at Scarlet Beach on the 22nd of September 1943. This is a brigade-level landing, and it's an opposed landing. It's the first opposed landing that the Australian Army has conducted since landing at Anzac Cove in the Gallipoli campaign. This landing shouldn't have faced too much opposition because the winning intelligence assessment was that there was only 350 Japanese troops in the area. By winning, I mean the intelligence assessment from the senior headquarters, the one that was used for all of the planning. If you're wondering who produced this assessment, that's right, it was Brigadier General Charles A. Willoughby, MacArthur's G2. And we've talked about him a few times, and we're going to talk about him a few times more as we look at the New Guinea campaign. How accurate was the assessment of 350 troops? Well, not so much. There was actually 5,000 troops in the Finschhafen and Saddleberg region. So, how long did the 20th Brigade have to plan their opposed landing at Finschhafen? Not long, because they had been involved in the 9th Division landing at Lae. This is a full division making an amphibious landing as a part of a pincer movement against Lae. They were the lead brigade for that landing, and that was on the 4th of September. This is just 18 days prior to their opposed landing. Think of the staff work, think of the coordination, think of the synchronisation that is required when it isn't just the Australian Army that's doing this. It is US engineers who will be providing the naval transport, and a lot of the air cover will be provided by the US Army Air Force. Think of all of the staff work that would be required to do that with only 18 days from one landing to the next. That is not a lot of time. It's certainly not a lot of time if you're looking to produce a 750-page op-ord. So, what are the problems and what are the solutions? Let's get to our interview with Colonel Jim Storr. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the podcast.
Good morning.
So first off, what was it that drove you to write Something Rotten?
Well, as I think I introduced in the book, I started asking people a couple of probing questions. And over a 10-year period, they all said the same thing. And those three things are basically that our headquarters are too big, that the orders they write are too long, and that they take too long to do it. And when you get, I think, something like 36 senior officers all saying the same thing, then maybe you think there is something wrong. You think about it a bit longer, and that becomes, I think there's something rotten. And that's where we are.
Indeed. And it's a global problem, really. It's something that's shared by many militaries.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it's got an awful lot worse since the Cold War. To be fair, I was a junior officer during the Cold War, but I ended up working in various headquarters, and things have definitely got bigger, stodgier, longer, and all those negative adjectives that you could come up with.
One of the big problems that's often talked about is that there is meant to be a golden thread that runs from strategy down to operations and then to tactics, but we seldom see that. Why do you think that is?
Well, two things. First of all, at the risk of being immodest, I think I'm the first writer to actually say that there should be. And I think that then goes on to the next point, because people aren't explicitly aware or haven't been explicitly aware of the need for it, then they blunder into what they think is right and good, not knowing that some of the consequences of that may be, and I think actually they are, negative.
How do we improve that process then? If at the tactical level there's no linkage to operations, let alone strategic, how do we improve that process?
Well, I think there are things that we can do at the tactical level, but I think it has to start from the top. If we get to the point where senior commanders realise they have to enunciate global statements of purpose, but that the purpose has to continue in a golden thread, but a continuous way all the way down, and there's an explicit awareness of that, then I think we might be better off. I think a good example is Vietnam. I don't want to criticise US forces, but I think enough of the literature says that they won loads of battles, but lost at the operational and perhaps the strategic levels, and that's probably because they weren't aware explicitly of that need for linkage between what the guys were actually doing on the ground, how that supported the operational aims in theatre, and how that supported US strategy. And without that, I think what we see and what people report is that a considerable number of those lives were regrettably lost in vain. And that's the whole point, I think, of the golden thread, that we should be able to avoid that. We should be better than that.
Part of that is getting a clear end state and a purpose from a government. How do militaries respond when a government is not keen on stating a desired end state or providing a purpose?
I think this is the point at which our senior commanders really have to earn their pay. They have to force politicians to say, where do you want to be? Now come up with a statement which, yes, by all means, give you a bit of sensible wiggle room and all those kind of things. But where do you want to be? Are you all right if we progress it this way? And then hold them to it. That's one side of it. But the other one is to stop that. I mean, we the soldiers tend to call it interference, and I think some of it is interference. But it is not the business of a minister as to where a particular platoon goes in Afghanistan. We need to keep their fingers out of that and say, look, Minister, with due respect, that business is your business. This business is our business. And things go wrong when you continuously interfere. And I think there's, as much as anything else, that's a educational point. Why would an elected politician newly arrived in post necessarily know those things?
Orders. When we look at orders, one of the key functions of a headquarters is to issue orders. And you've got some really good examples in the book. So Haig's orders on the first day of the Somme, 57 pages for 13 divisions conducting a deliberate attack, some of those divisions in combat for the first time. You then compare it with a single corps attack today where for 3 divisions, those orders may run to 750 pages. Why is it that orders have become so bloated in overtime?
I think that the main thread is a peacetime wish for completeness, which largely comes out of the school, meaning actually in that case the staff colleges. Oh, you haven't done the X annex. Oh, you haven't covered this. Oh, you haven't covered that. I think that's misplaced. And without some kind of continuing operational penalty against that, then it just becomes easier and easier and easier. And they've just got longer and longer and longer. Let's park that thought for a moment, because the second thread is to do with digital IT, which makes it physically possible to do that. During the Cold War, certainly in the British Army, a battle group didn't have a photocopier. Right at the end of the Cold War, it received a fax which worked incredibly slowly, and it had no means, apart from mechanical reproduction, of producing orders. What it meant was that battle group level rarely produced written orders, and if they did, there were a few sides. The ones that I saw at brigade, and I was working in brigade headquarters, 1991, 1992, got up to maybe, I think the sort of epitome that I saw was about 6 sides, and with the annexes came up to about 15 sides. But that was at least in part because that was physically as much as the staff and the staff support could produce at the time. Now, if you make the fact that it's much easier to do these things and transmit them, and you add that to a tendency to go for a perception of completeness and thoroughness, then you just get things getting longer and longer and longer. And I think that's what we observe.
And those orders are taking a lot longer to produce as well.
Yes, and the good example is the Kosovo operation for the Ace Rapid Reaction Corps, where it comes from, I think, what is variously called JHQ Naples, and it arrives at the ARC, I think the ARC Forward headquarters, and it's 2 lever Dutch files thick. It is used literally as the door prop for the GOC's office, but more to the point, it arrived after the operation was underway, and that's the initiating op order. Well, when it gets to that point, this is clearly ridiculous. That 750 or 1,000 page or 5 kilogram order is clearly not contributing anything useful.
It's interesting. One of the things that really caught my eye is that the fact that we've lost the value of time, particularly when we're wargaming against an enemy which is our own force playing the red team. They're using the same bloated procedures. And I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned that the Soviets believed that a force acting twice as fast was 5 times as effective. And yet we now have a process that has slowly, over time, grown longer and longer. How do we then decrease the amount of time that it takes to generate orders?
Yeah, the first thing to say is that the twice as fast and 5 times effective thing, it's a very good statement. I believe that it's fundamentally true, but it's a classic of espoused and enacted behaviour. That is, what people say is good. And I haven't heard many British officers or other officers actually saying that is not actually what they do in practice. That's the first thing to do. But how do we get it faster? Well, the main thing actually is to impose a requirement that it should be faster. Now, there's 2 ways of doing that. One is artificially. So, for example, in training, if brigade commander told his staff, right, next time we receive an order from Division or higher or whoever, we are going to get the orders out to battle groups in 2 hours, bust. And a battalion 1 hour, bust. Then I think people will rapidly realise that they've really got to focus on the essentials. They've got to get a good, sound, working set of orders out, and they've got to do it in a timely manner. That's one thing. But I think related to that, and probably even more important, is something you mentioned yourself. It's about, if you like, the command post exercise syndrome, the CPX syndrome, where the enemy do the same sort of things. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is because they are like us in the same processes. But the other thing is that the way that those exercises are set up with extensive main events lists, MELs, these things are required to take a certain amount of time so that the exercise goes according to plan, and so on and so forth. The moment we get away from that, where we get genuinely 2-sided, genuinely adversarial, genuinely free play command post exercises, somebody somewhere, the lumbering dinosaurs, are going to realize that they're being beaten consistently by the guy who can do something violent, unpleasant, but faster than them. And once we get into doing that, the faster than them will become a virtuous circle. Everyone will want to do it faster. The bad guys will do it faster. We'll do it faster. And everyone will end up doing faster. And going back to where I started on this one, and people will realize that setting, for example, 2 hours at a brigade or 1 hour at a battle group is actually a sensible thing to aim for.
Looking at the process, we see in many command posts the staff driving to a significant extent the decision-making process. How do you think the role of the commander has changed from probably World War II through to today?
I think it's basically just a failure. I think that in the Second World War, commanders knew that they were responsible for what happened, or dare I say, in their command, on their watch, whatever, and therefore they thought about things in great detail, perhaps more importantly, in great depth, and they told their staff what it was that they wanted to achieve. And I think largely through this explosion of process that has happened largely through the staff colleges, but also through the collective training centres, that has all switched away to the point where what they've become is a way for exercising the staff to do a fixed set of processes as laid down in Allied Joint Publication X, rather than something like, can you come up with a workable plan and do so in a way that's likely to beat the enemy, that is to say, fairly quick.
How do we train staffs and commanders to be able to do that? Because I think one of the advantages that commanders had in the Second World War was that they had a significant amount of on-the-job training, and those that could command were promoted and those that couldn't were sacked. How do we do that in an environment where we're not getting that real-time feedback about what works and what doesn't?
Well, part of it is that we're not getting real-time feedback from our command post exercises as to which commanders can do it and which can't. In other words, we're not getting that feedback. We're getting feedback. I mean, I've seen one of these. It was for a British brigade, and they got I don't know what it's called, a validation exercise or something from their appropriate training headquarters. And it was something like a page and a half of completely unintelligible gobbledygook by way of a summary, and then 20 pages which were all about staff process. Well, if that's the feedback that brigade is getting from a CPX, of course what it will do is pay attention to the CPX. If, on the other hand, the superior commander, let's say the divisional commander or whoever, came down and had a quiet word with the brigade commander and said, your headquarters is not up to it, you need to work at that. But more to the point, the plan that you came up with, which is yours, just wasn't sharp enough, you need to do better. And by the way, I've got 3 brigadiers and only one of you is going to make it Major General. Draw the right deduction. That's not happening.
The size of headquarters has grown immensely since the Second World War. And I think there's a quote from Manstein that says, ever bigger staff, ever worse command. What impact does that have on the command function?
I think there's several. One is the physical liability, and by liability I mean the word correctly. We've just produced the most significant military targets the world has ever seen, which is something which is relatively easy to neutralise, and if you do, then it has massive consequences. Just think what would happen if, say, for example, a British or American or whoever else's division headquarters was hit by a frog, meaning a rocket overground, a Russian surface missile. Now, you may say, that wouldn't happen. Well, American Brigade headquarters was hit by a frog in the early days in Iraq. These things do happen. Now, what actually happened in that case, and I think it's quite interesting, is the fact that one of the armoured vehicles still had comms, and within something like 15 or 20 minutes, they had a minimum operating capability to go forward. Well, I think that tells you about what you actually need rather than what you think you need. And if we deliberately aim towards the minimum requirement rather than the ritzy-glitzy, well, we can do this and we can do that and we can bolt that on, iterate for 30, 40 years and you end up with something which is quite ridiculous.
Why is it that the size of the staff has increased so much? What do you think has driven that?
Mostly the assumption that planning should be a collective process. So you get a lot of guys standing around a map table or whatever it is, and they're all talking to each other and they're all doing this, that and the other. And everything has become open plan. And because of that, there is a requirement for an assumption that everybody has to say their part. So, for example, I don't know, brigade, you get the G35 guy talks for a while, and then the G2 guy, well, in fact, he's probably already sung. But then you ask the AVAN guy, the aviation guy, what he thinks, and the artillery guy, what he thinks, and so on and so forth. And it's all a large collective process. Back up to and including the Cold War, it wasn't. Usually the chief of staff or the planner at divisional level would basically get his head into something, and he would then tell those people, if he thought it was necessary, what it was that they were to do. Clearly there needed to be a bit of feedback. The gunner would say, well, we can't do that because, but we can do that, or whatever. But a lot of those kind of conversations went on in the background outside of formal planning anyway. Just to take that example, the planner's doing something and the artillery guy comes in and says, just be aware that for the next 12 hours we can't do the following until we get that replay or something. So that sort of stuff was mediated, but what is now the case is it's now become a formal part of the process that has to be ticked at the right place in the tick in the box, not least so that the guys who run the collective training exercises can go through with their clipboards and tick the tick in the box, and those things get done. And this gets to ridiculous extent. I mean, just as an example, I saw some really good guys in a British brigade, and they had a receipt of orders briefing, which took longer to do than the brigade in which I served in all those years ago. It would have taken the brigade chief of staff to write the whole order. Well, that's just ridiculous. The timings, for what it's worth, was about 40 minutes. So just to brief the staff on what they were to do to plan the operation took longer it would have taken to plan the operation.
That's very scary when you consider that the most precious commodity that we've got is time.
Well, I agree with you, but of course that I go back to espoused and enacted behaviour. That's not the way they behave when you watch them on a command post exercise. The way they behave is that the most important thing is that they are seen to be going through the process. And if I can just pick up on another thought that you asked, how do we cut these things down and all the rest of it? If there was an awareness that we need to do things faster, we would do things faster. And I have to say, I am enormously rewarded. There's a Brit guy, his name is now Lieutenant Colonel Andy Breach. He was Major Andy Breach. But when he was a major, he decided that things, well, between him and his boss, that things had to be done faster at brigade level. And he produced an article which basically got things at brigade down to about 4 hours. Now, as he said himself, Jim Storr would not think that's fast enough, but at least it shows some awareness that we need to do things faster. I spoke at our staff college about 10 days ago, and he spoke after me. And we had a great question from a lady officer who says, how do we do this? Can we do these things faster? And I just said, and of course I knew what was about to happen, I said, please ask the next speaker. And Andy Breach, who was next up, just told them exactly how they could do it. So there is good news here. We can move in the right direction. Once we get an awareness, and I know I would agree with you entirely, that the most valuable asset is time, because warfare is inherently time competitive.
The increase in communications bandwidth and the proliferation of sensors that we see on the battlefield, what have they done to headquarters and their processes?
Yeah, again, entirely negative. And it shouldn't be, and it needn't be. It's ridiculous, and it was just done badly. There is a very great truism that goes back probably as far as the Battle of Jutland, but it's basically that signalling or communications expands to fill the bandwidth available. And so when you give people bits, bytes, tera, whatever it is, of comms, then they will just use it. And so, for example, I did my MSc in 1993. At the time, it was actually about the use of UAVs for tactical reconnaissance. At the time, we just could not see that we would ever get enough bandwidth to use moving, coloured imagery. It was a real problem. And so part of my MSc was about, does the human brain actually need coloured imagery? Is, for example, moving imagery in near real time good enough if it's black and white? Those kind of questions. But to take exactly that analogy, if you look today in any of the headquarters I was considering, which was basically Battle Group Brigade Division, they now, first of all, would absolutely insist that they need that kind of feed and that they get it. Well, do they actually need it? Does somebody somewhere need it? Who is that person? Do you need, for example, that the divisional commander in his command post can see that thing? Well, no, you don't, but because you provide it, you think you need it, and you get into that kind of vicious circle.
What does that do to decision making when there's a proliferation of communications capability and sensors?
Two things. First of all, it slows it down. And then secondly, it makes it worse because it becomes lowest common denominator. Oh, but we need to do that. Oh, we need to do that. Oh, we need to do that. And they end up trying to do 36 things, and they end up doing most of them poorly instead of any of them well.
How do you think that the ability to communicate, which has been obviously enhanced massively over the last 20 years, what is the impact that that's had on mission command, do you think?
In practice, over command. A commander can look right down into what, well, in theory, what every soldier's doing. I don't think that's a practicality. But there are so many reports in various books written by other observers of people observing that in the early days, say, of Iraq or Afghanistan, there were things that were being done at company level. And 8-9 years later, they were being reserved for brigade level decisions. And if that's happening, then basically you're disincentivizing, disempowering those people at lower levels. Now, if that's mission command, it's not the mission command that I was ever taught. And very interestingly, and I won't go into detail now, but I've got one book on my left and one book on my right in which you compare what people were saying when it was written in 1995 and what people were saying in 2006. It's very interesting how the emphasis on mission command as taught has went away during that period from decentralization, trust, mutual understanding, to discipline, the duty to fulfill the mission, and those things, which I wouldn't disagree with at all. But I think those were there before we had mission command, perhaps implicitly. The whole new thing about mission command was trust and decentralization, and particularly decentralization. And what a lot of the criticism I hear is about is the fact that that's the bit that's not happening.
The trust with subordinates and superiors?
Well, it's not so much the trust, it's decentralization isn't happening. Therefore, it implies that the superior commander doesn't trust the junior. He would say, of course I trust the guy, but he needs to do that, rather than letting him getting on with it. In other words, give him a free run, the decentralization bit. Trust is an interesting thing. Trust is deserved, not demanded. I think one of Patton's really great quotes is about loyalty, which is, if you think about it, is the other side of the same coin. He said, we hear an awful lot about the loyalty of subordinates to their superior. We hear almost nothing about the other way around. And I think if you look at a lot of our, otherwise admirable people, you say, yes, general, yes, brigadier general, whatever, yes, colonel. But do you actually demonstrate to your subordinates that you trust them and you will have their back if they make a well-intentioned mess up? I think an awful lot of this comes down to, this goes back through the centuries, tolerance of well-intentioned failure.
I think that's a good point. It leads on to one of my questions. Have we lost the ability to do a risk assessment, to be able to manage risk?
I think the whole risk management thing is grossly overdone, because what really happened was about 20 years ago, I wouldn't like to say exactly when, we introduced risk management methodologies as another, lo and behold, explicit process from basically business practice. And so it's become another tick in the box thing. It's another thing where somebody has to go down a list and say, are we managing this risk? Are we managing that risk? Are we mitigating it? Those kind of things. Rather than, this is a completely different thread of thought, commanders intuitively knowing what things are risky, what sort of things are likely to be able to mitigate risks, and what sort of things do we think we can genuinely manage, that is, do, because in practice, that risk won't rise. And I think an awful lot of this is a replacement of explicit process for intuitive knowledge.
And that intuitive knowledge that's built up over time through experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, people say, but we don't train half as much as we used to. Well, that may be true, but the way that we use that training is very, very time intensive. And so, just as a case in point, this last weekend I was out with an Army Reserve unit and they were all great guys. But in the weekend, they basically had one iteration of a plan. Well, in that time, literally, you could have done a dozen. And after doing it a dozen times, those guys and gals would have gone away with a much better feeling for that kind of operation than they did at the end of it.
We'll leave the interview there. Next week, we will come back and look at the impact that these problems have on mission command and some of the solutions that are available to us.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.